This technique of animation is called recursive subdivision. It's a really simple technique, especially with the help of geometry nodes, and we're going to learn how to create this particular loop. So without any further discussions, let's learn how to create it. In our default scene, we're going to go ahead and bring our cursor to the junction of these two windows, click and drag to create a new window. We're going to change the type from the 3D viewport to the geometry node editor, and press new to add in a new geometry node tree. Then, as customs demands, we're going to select the group input and hit X to delete our default cube. Now we can press Shift A and search for a grid node, which is going to act as the basis to our entire animation. We can plug the mesh into the geometry of the group output and just increase the size on the X and the Y to something like 10 so that we have enough area to work with. Apart from that, we don't need the vertices to be 3 because we're going to use a subdivide mesh node right after this, so we'll decrease those to 2. Apart from that, we can also switch on our viewport display from solid to wire so that we can actually see the subdivisions as we add them in. So now we'll press Shift A and search for the subdivide mesh node and plug that in right after the grid and increase the levels to something like 3. Remember, the amount you change this changes the final effect. So now, after the subdivide mesh, we want to randomly select a few of these faces and continue to subdivide them even more. To do that, we'll press Shift A and search for a separate geometry node and plug that in, and we get an option to actually select a bunch of them. So to select it, we could use a noise texture and a color ramp, but another method that works is searching for a random value node and changing the type from float to boolean and plugging the value into the selection. So that way you can see a bunch of points were selected and removed. However, we want it to be only the faces that are selected, so we'll change it from point to face, and now we get faces that have been removed. The thing is that the faces are not actually removed, but they exist as the selection as well as the other faces that were not selected. So you have both of them, and if you join them together, you'll get the entire mesh. So we can press Shift A and search for a join geometry node and just plug that in. Now, before we plug the inverted into the join geometry, we can actually subdivide these even further. So we'll press Shift A and search for a subdivide mesh node and just plug the inverted into the mesh and then plug the output of this mesh into the join geometry. So now we get this type of subdivision. The next thing is again selecting a random number of these faces and subdividing them even more. So to do that, we require these 4 nodes, and we can just plug these again and again. So we'll take the group output, move it to the side, and we'll just remove this junction for now. Select these 4 nodes, press Shift D, and now plug the geometry into the geometry and this geometry into the group output. Along with that, you can always change the seed to get different variations. Now, every time you do this, you're actually adding in more geometry, and you can make as many levels as you want. Just remove the group output, take these last 4 nodes, press Shift D, plug the geometry into the geometry and this into the output. I think for the complexity that I want, I will go with just one more level. So detach the group output, select the nodes, press Shift D, plug them in, and we're done. Of course, keep changing the seeds till you get something that you like. The next step to this is actually extruding the faces by random amounts. And to do that, you're going to have to switch from the wireframe view to the solid view to actually be able to see the faces, and then press Shift A and search for an extrude mesh node and just plug that in. Now we have to make sure that the individual is checked, and we're going to be playing around with the offset scale to actually get the effect that we're looking for. So we don't want all of them to increase by the same amount, so we're going to play around with the offset scale using a noise texture. We'll press Shift A and search for a noise texture and just plug the color into the offset scale. Now the thing is that the output of this noise texture is going to be from 0 to 1, so we don't get too much of height. So to increase the height, we'll press Shift A and search for a math node, and we'll set it from add to multiply and then just increase the value so that we get more variation in the actual height. Apart from that, the noise right now is too small, and that's why you get a much more random variation in the heights, which looks maybe like a city scene or something like that. And that might be what you're looking for. When you animate it by changing this from 3D to 4D, you'll see that the movement also happens a lot closer to each other. And again, this could be the type of motion that you're looking for in your particular animation, but it's not what I'm looking for. So what I'm going to do is change the scale all the way down to maybe something like 1.4. And that way you can actually see the nice waviness of the noise texture. Maybe you can reduce it even more, 0.8. And this is the kind of look that I'm actually going for. So that's all there is for the modeling part. However, we're going to have to go ahead and set a material. So we'll press Shift A and search for the set material node and plug that in right here. and change it to the default material. The next thing that we have to do is the animation. Before we start off with the animation, we'll go ahead and set our defaults. So we'll go to the output properties and change the frame rate to 30 frames per second and the end frame to 300 so that it's a 10-second long animation. After that, we'll change the output to wherever you want it to be, and the file format is going to be FFmpeg video with an encoding container changed to MPEG-4 and output quality of perceptually lossless. Once you've done those, you can go ahead and play around with the noise texture to loop it in the same way that we've done in many of the previous videos that you definitely should check out. The first thing that we'll do is press back to go to frame 0 and then press Shift D to duplicate the noise texture, and on frame 0 we'll change the W value on the first noise texture to 0 and hover over it and press I. And to actually mix these two noise textures, we'll press Shift A and search for a mix node. If you're using 3.3 or earlier, it'll be called the mix RGB, and then we'll have to change it from float to color. Plug that right in there and take the second noise texture and plug it into the second socket of the mix node. Then you can change the W for the second noise texture to something like 2 and then press I, and change the factor all the way to 0 and press I. Then you can go all the way to frame 300 and just change the W value on the second noise texture to 0, the W value on the first noise texture to the negative of whatever you had for the second noise texture, and then press I. Press I over the second noise texture as well, and increase the factor all the way to 1 and press I. Once you're done with that, select all 3 of the nodes and then come down here, press A to make sure all the keyframes are selected, and then press T linear. And that way you get your animation. You can check the speed and everything from here. If you think it is too slow, make sure that you change the playback from play every frame to frame dropping, and that way you get a realistic idea of exactly how it is. Then if you want to make it even slower, just change the W values from -2 and +2 to maybe -1 and +1 to make it slower. If you want it to be faster, increase the W values. So maybe I can change the W value to -3 and press I, and then also on frame 0, change this W value to 3 and press I. So that way it'll actually move a little faster. That's all there is for the animation, and now we can actually set up the scene and start the texturing. To set up the scene, we'll select our camera, press Alt G to clear location, Alt R to clear rotation, and then just grab it on the Z axis to bring it up so that we can actually see it. And then we can actually rotate it on the x-axis by something like 45 or 50 degrees. And then we can press 0 to go into our camera view, go to the camera settings over here and change the focal length down to something like 25, just so that we get a wider field of view. And then we can press GY and bring it back so that more of the grid is seen. And of course, we don't want any areas like this to be seen where there's nothing in the camera view itself. So we'll just take the camera and grab it and move it on the Z-axis down till those edges are not seen. And then again, grab it on the Y to just move it and centralize it. And this should be perfect. Once you've set the camera, you can just play the animation to make sure everything is fitting in. But as you can see, in certain frames, the edge corner is still seen. However, I think that's small enough to not be noticeable. So I'm going to leave it as is. I'll go to viewport display and increase passport out all the way to 1 so that we don't see anything outside the camera view. After you're done with that, you can start off the actual texturing. So we'll go to our render properties and switch on ambient occlusion initially, and to see the changes, we'll change it from solid view to rendered view. And you can see we have these shadows created from the light and we don't need them. So we're going to select the light and press delete to remove the light. Now we can see some ambient occlusion, but it's very minimal. So we'll expand the ambient occlusion, increase the factor from 1 to something like 10, and increase the distance from 0.2 to something like 1. And immediately all of these cubes pop much more. And that's the basis for our shading. The next thing that we can do is switch on screen space reflections to get really nice reflections, but to actually see them, you need to make this material metallic. Since we've already applied the material in the geometry nodes, we can go ahead and change from the geometry node editor to the shader editor, select this particular cube, and then if you can't find the nodes, press period on your numpad to centralize all the nodes. And what we'll do is we'll just increase the metallicness all the way to 1. Apart from that, we'll also reduce the roughness to 0.4. And to actually make the scene a lot lighter, we'll go to our world properties and increase the color all the way to white. Now, even though the color is white, it feels washed out and grayish. So we'll go to our render properties, go all the way down to color management and change it from filmic to standard. And that way the white actually looks a lot whiter. Now, once you've done this, you can play around with the ambient occlusion a little bit more, maybe increase the factor even higher to 100. And of course, you can play around with the trace precision, as well as switching on and off the bent normals to just see what you feel looks good for you. I'm going to leave the bent normals on and the trace precision all the way to 0. And finally, after all of that, the last thing that I'd like to do is just give the base color a hue of 0.5 and a very, very little bit of saturation. So maybe a saturation of 0.1, and that's going to give a slight bluish tint, which I think suits the metallicness of the material. And that's all there is for this particular animation. Of course, now that this is blue, the actual sides are noticeable. So I'm just going to take the camera and grab down the Z and move it down a little bit more. And that's all there is to this animation. The last thing that you have to do is press render animation. I hope you learned something cool from that particular video. If you've watched through all the way, thank you so much. The watch time really helps me. You don't have to use this material on a grid. You could do the exact same process for a torus or any other shape of your choice. And there's a lot more that you could do, such as adding textures and things like that. However, I wanted to keep the video nice and short. So comment down if you liked this video and what you'd want to see next. If you liked this video, be sure to check out other videos on my channel. I'm sure you'll find something or the other that you'll definitely enjoy. And until the next video comes out tomorrow, don't forget to stay creative.